Hello and welcome to this digital course by Presenting the Past for the Isle of Axholme and Hatfield Chase Landscape Partnership. This course is all about farming on the Isle of Axholme, and we're going to be looking at a number of different aspects. So without further ado, let's get started. Now, before we get into it, whilst not essential, in order for you to get the most out of this online course, we do recommend that you have a pen and paper to hand. Now, this is useful just for making notes as you go throughout the course, and also I will be throwing in a couple of little activities to be doing as well, and you'll find the pen and paper very useful for that. Now, on a practical note, if you need to pause this course, if you want to take it in shorter segments or just pop away for a cup of coffee, you can, of course, pause this at any time, it being a digital course. However, we are going to be stopping halfway through as well as a suggested break point. And even if you don't feel like you need it, I do suggest you take a break then, take a stretch, walk around the room just to get away from the screen for a little bit. Now, aims for this course. Now, this course aims to increase your understanding of the history and impact of farming on the Isle of Axholme and Hatfield Chase area. At the end of this course, you should have an increased understanding about the history of farming in this landscape and be able to identify the remains of some medieval farming practices if you choose to go for a walk in the area. You should also be able to understand how the effects of drainage and enclosure have really changed the landscape and have created the Isle of Axholme as we see it today. Before we get into it though, I do think it's important that you understand where this course has come from. So this course has been commissioned by the Isle of Axholme and Hatfield Chase Landscape Partnership. Now, this is a huge project that consists of 5 different organisations: North Lincolnshire Council, Natural England, Crowell Peatland Railway Society, the Canal and River Trust, and Doncaster Metropolitan Council. Now, this partnership was awarded £1.84 million by the Heritage Lottery Fund, which has allowed 16 different projects to take place within the study area. So everyone who is listening to this who is a national lottery player, you have helped pay for this course and lots of other activities that have been going on. Now, this is part of the Presenting the Past programme, which is one of those 16 projects. We have been focusing on 3 different parishes in the area: Belton, Haxey and Oaston Ferry. And we have been conducting a lot of volunteer-led workshops and opportunities, from research to field walking, excavation, building recording. We've been working in schools, working in village halls, working in people's back gardens. Wherever people have wanted to investigate more about their history and heritage in that area, we have been working alongside them and enabling them. Now, this course was designed as part of the desire by people to learn more about the effect of farming in this very, very rural landscape. And hopefully you'll be able to learn and appreciate that more as we go along. Now, Presenting the Past, who are we? We are Heritage Lincolnshire. We are a charity who works to conserve the heritage of this fascinating county. And to do this, we deliver activities for people to learn about it, gain new skills and get involved. We believe that our work makes Lincolnshire a better place to work and visit, and that our cultural activities help enrich people's lives. So we do many things that you may have heard of. If you've heard of Heritage Open Days, we do help to organise that in the county. We help to look after buildings. We've even got a commercial archaeology unit who go and do work to actually discover some of the heritage themselves. If you want to learn more about us, please do research or Google Heritage Lincolnshire and you'll find our website. And there is lots of information there about how you can get further involved or learn more about this county's heritage. And the last thing before we start is, who am I? Who is this strange voice speaking to you through your computer? I'm Lydia Hendry. I'm a community archaeologist with Heritage Lincolnshire. Just as a quick background to my experience, I studied archaeology at university and continued on to do a master's. I have been working for Heritage Lincolnshire since 2018 now, and I really specialise in working both with one hand with the archaeology and one half with communities, and I really enjoy bridging that gap and helping people to really engage with the heritage around them. I have been working with the Presenting the Past project pretty much since the beginning, and I have been helping out with lots of the different activities going on in the area. So without any further talking, let's begin with how farming began and its impact. So we are going to be starting by looking at the very, very beginnings of the Isle of Axholme, actually how farming came to the area and how that changed the landscape. As we get started, I do want to just quickly take you through what the Isle of Axholme is, geologically speaking, and why that is significant. So, first of all, we are going to be starting with the solid geology. So this is the ground that is very deep underneath us and is what the Isle of Axholme is built on. This is the ground rock deep under the soil. The oldest ground rock we really find in this country was laid down during the Triassic period, which is around 220 million years ago. Now, this is actually what we find underneath the Isle of Axholme. Then around, of course, 300,000 years ago, everyone's heard of the Ice Age. Now, at this point, the entire county, pretty much for Lincolnshire, was covered in an ice sheet that was hundreds of meters deep. Now, the effect of this ice sheet was it helped to erode the rock, and by eroding the rock, it created a very, very fine clayey type mixture that we call till deposits. And then it carried all that ground up rock, those till deposits, further down and deposited them in different areas. And in doing so, it left this hump, as we can see here. And this is what the Isle of Axholme is built on. Now, of course, the Ice Age didn't last forever. And when it started to disappear, we get different things happening. So first of all, when the ice sheet disappeared, the lack of vegetation allowed the wind to then come down and erode and to break down the softer soils. And some of this was then laid up on top of the bedrock to create all the soils that the vegetation now grows on. To the sides of this dugout area, we've got deep peat deposits developing, which is where all the waterlogged areas were. And then by the rivers that were surrounding this area, we got the alluvial soils. So this is soil that the rivers are bringing into the area. Now, this is incredibly rich soil and is in part why the Isle of Axholme is so good for farming today. It has this really, really good mix of rich soils with a really good supply of water year round. Now, I have taken these images from an historical atlas of Lincolnshire, and that's a really good book if you do want to get a good overview of the county. But you can see a map first of the solid geology and the drift geology. In that solid geology area, you can see that almost that island of Triassic bedrock. That's where the Isle of Axholme is, just to the side over here. And then the drift geology, you can see all these other soils being created around it, the wind-blown soil on top, the alluvial soils around with the peat deposits. It is creating this quite distinct area. Now, the first people who came to the area may have been Paleolithic, but we first start to see real signs of people living up here in the Mesolithic. Now, this is after the ice sheet has gone. So what we have here in this time is a landscape of meandering narrow rivers with floodplains in the wet seasons. On the dry ground, you've got mixed forests, and this would have been incredibly attractive to seasonal hunter-gatherers. So these are groups of people who don't have any permanent settlement but are moving around the landscape according to where food can be found at different times of year. The artifacts we find from the Mesolithic are often found around streams and rivers, and that's because these really are the highways and byways. It's a lot easier to take your boat up and down a river than it is to fight your way through a forest. Now, about the Isle of Axholme, because of the amount of water, the amount of rivers, it's almost quite a marshy and coastal environment. And while today we might hear the word marsh and think that's quite an unattractive area to be, if you're a hunter-gatherer, that is your prime real estate area. It's highly coveted. This is because you have a mix of the land and the sea. On the land, you've got your large game, so your deer and aurochs possibly. Then on the marshy water areas, you've got marine mammals, you've got fish, crustaceans, shellfish, you've got lots of different sources of food. Now, in other areas of the country, we have found evidence that these marshy type sites are exploited heavily, and often heavily at particular times of year. So, for example, big deposits of rubbish, basically left behind by Mesolithic hunter-gatherers, of bones of the fish they've been hunting, show that they come in, they heavily exploit an area for a season, and then move on. So with the, for example, the red deer, the elk, the aurochs, roe deer, wild boar, they won't be finding on land. That might be attracting them to come to the area during the summer. In terms of what plants they were using, it's a lot more difficult to tell because, of course, they do not survive in the archaeological record quite as easily. And so there is a bit of a grey line between when hunters and gatherers became farmers, and it quite likely is going to be a very gradual transition, although there is some debate about that in the archaeological community. What we do start to see is that the pollen record is showing that there were lots of fires being set during the later Mesolithic, and this starts to increase the later in the Mesolithic we get. Now, lots of fires being set might well be evidence that the woodland is being cleared. So this is man-made changing of the environment. And the reason people would want to be clearing the woodland might well be because they are trying to create farmland. They are starting to plant their own crops and need the space to do that. Creating fires also creates spaces in the woodlands, which then creates meadows, and so might well be attracting wild animals to the area to make them easier to hunt. So it could be either. Like I said, it's quite hard to tell. Either way, hunter and gatherers towards the end of the Mesolithic are really starting to manipulate the environment to suit their needs. So it's not farming as we see it today, but it is still manipulating the landscape. It's a step down this journey. Now, a good example of one of these seasonal hunting sites can be found near Ouston Ferry, where 178 flints were found, and at least 30% of this, was from the late Mesolithic. So this is really good evidence of a hunting camp area. It was probably a seasonal base camp with flint tools being made and used, and it was just on a little inlet. So it would have been ideally placed for hunting activities in the surrounding wetlands. So in the Mesolithic, before we get farming, a really varied diet. People just starting to manipulate the landscape and starting to move down this road to farming. But the question is, who actually invented farming? Who actually brought it to this area? Now, farming was started in a couple of different places in the world, but most people tend to think that the influence of farming for Britain came from the Middle East, in an area that's commonly called the Fertile Crescent, because this is a really, really fertile area of land, and so lended itself to people experimenting with growing, with raising animals. Now here, we often see something referenced called the Neolithic package. Now, the move from the Mesolithic to the Neolithic is the difference between hunter and gatherers gatherers and farming. And so to move into the Neolithic in the archaeological record, we want to see as many different elements of this Neolithic package as possible. Now, often this is evidence of domesticated grains, so people growing food, evidence of domestic animals, so people raising their own animals rather than hunting wild ones. We often start to see permanent house sets. It's the first time we see people actually building houses that are going to last because they are staying in the same area all year round. And we also start to see pottery. Pottery, of course, is a really important product for collecting milk, collecting water, and for gathering in grains. So those are all different elements of the Neolithic package. Now, we start to see this around 9000 BC in the Middle East, but we only start to see it around 4000 BC in the UK. Now, this is because, of course, the climate is very, very different in the Middle East than it is in the UK, and it takes time for those technology and those grains to become adapted to these different climates. And so it gradually moves across the Middle East and up into Britain. Now, this is a huge area of debate in the archaeological community. Is the introduction of farming, the adoption of different ways of living by people who are living in the UK, as they see people in Europe living differently to them? Or is it people in Europe, farmers, moving across to Britain and moving out, making the hunter-gatherers move on? So is it hunter-gatherers becoming farmers, or is it the farmers coming in and taking over the land? Currently, evidence seems to be supporting that it was a group of farmers coming across to Britain and displacing the resident hunter-gatherers. Now, this is based on different pieces of genetic work, and certainly it's an area that's still under review now, so might well change again in the future. But currently, we're thinking a complete population change. But this does kind of raise the question of why take up farming? So for 2 to 5 million years, humans have been being hunter-gatherers. What goes wrong? Why do we need to take up farming in the first place? Well, as we can see, 2.5 million years is a long time. We are hunter-gatherers, and we are very successful hunter-gatherers at that. And then we hit farming, and that's roughly where this line is here in the Middle East. And the main difference you can see is population. It almost doubles, and then it gradually increases and increases and increases. There we go, this is farming getting to the UK around, on a steady upward incline. 2 to 5 million years, absolutely steady. And then we're moving up and up and up and up. Now, this is because farming is a much more intensive form of food cultivation. And of course, with more food, we can support more people. Now, you would think this would also mean a healthier people. However, a lot of evidence suggests that once we start farming, we actually become a lot more unhealthy as people. Now, this is due to a few different things. First of all, with bigger family groups, a bad year, a famine, a failed harvest, that's going to cause starvation amongst a lot of different people. And we do see in people's bones that we see periods of stress in the growth of those bones, which do suggest years of starvation. And so weaker people, or at least people who are not being fed as well. With people living with animals, we also get the introduction of zoonotic diseases. Now, these are diseases that jump from animals to people. And so we get increased diseases coming around as well. And of course, the more people you get, the more frequently these diseases can pass between people. So farming, yes, we have more food, but doesn't necessarily mean that we are healthier as a population. Now, I always like to point this out, it's not strictly related to our talk, but of course we can see there is one massive dip, and that is the Black Death, the plague. That did reduce the population of the planet by around 1/3. So it does show the effect that diseases have on our species. And then, of course, the other huge area we can see on this graph of note is here, where we suddenly shoot up into our current population statistics. Now, this is caused by the Industrial Revolution, and this, of course, is really increased by our understanding of diseases. Suddenly we have hospitals, we know how to treat people, we know how to prevent disease, and of course, our food systems are becoming more stable as well. So a lot of our population growth, it depends on farming. This is a huge change, and it is going to change the landscape on the Isle of Axholme as well. Let's see how that happens. The Neolithic Revolution. So going back to the Isle of Axholme, what evidence do we have? Well, remember that Neolithic package I was talking about? First of all, one of the best things we can look for are houses, footprints of houses left behind. There are none. And this is actually quite distinctive of the Britain as a whole. It seems to be that we're not taking on the whole Neolithic package straight away. We're taking it on in our own way, being adapted to the environment. However, what we do have in the Neolithic is a lot of axe heads, especially in the south of the Isle. In some of the work we've been doing for this project, I've been talking to farmers and they'll say, oh yes, I've got a Neolithic axe head at home. It seems quite common. Now, this is actually hugely significant as well because it is indicative of land clearance. If you've got an axe head, you're using it to chop down trees. So much like the fire we were seeing in the late Mesolithic, this is people clearing landscapes, creating farmland. So this is how we see the Neolithic Revolution in the area, not perhaps through houses, but through mass clearance of the forests that was around here. So if you walk on the Isle of Axholme today, you see those rolling hills, those farmland areas. This is when they were first created, around 4,000 years BC. That's around 6,000 years ago from today. So there we go. That is how farming arrived to the Isle and the changes that that caused in society and how that came about. So now that we have farming, we are going to take a very, very brief journey through the ages and look at how farming continued to transform on the Isle and continued to become an important way of life for people on the Isle. Now, this is going to be a very, very brief overview. Obviously, we're going through a lot of time, so I'm not going to be going into too much detail in any one period. There we go. So we actually start with environmental collapse. So we've moved on from the Neolithic into the next period, which we call the Bronze Age. Now, during the Bronze Age, rising sea level and climatic deterioration really started to impede drainage. So that's all the rivers moving around the area, how the water moved around the area. And this caused more peat to form on areas such as Thorn and Hatfield moors. This meant that, once again, water levels were changing. So woodland in the area was completely drowned out. And we do still sometimes find this in digs because it's been preserved under the ground. With such a widespread inundation of this lowland area, the Isle of Axholme actually became an isle. This is where the name comes from. It became an island and isolated, caused by the surrounding rivers of the Idle, of the Torn, the Don, the Trent, and all of their associated wetlands. However, human settlement continued. So we're still seeing people living in this area, even though the environment is changing for them. And then we skip past the Iron Age in this overview, and we're moving straight to the Romans. Now, this report we have here from Buckland and Sadler, written in 1985, does suggest that by the Roman period, landscape isn't too dissimilar from the modern one we see today. So we've got overmanaged areas at the edge of fenland streams, the fields with the settlements. It's a very similar landscape. It was one that we would recognise if we went back. Now, just beyond the Isle of Axholme, if we look outside of the Isle of Axholme quickly, we see the characteristic Roman developments. We see military sites, towns, roads. In rural areas, we have villa estates, farmsteads with very regular square rectangular field systems. Now, there aren't any really major Roman sites on the Isle, but we do see some from just outside. So Doncaster and Rossington to the west, along Ermine Street to the east. But their influence would have been felt on the Isle. And correspondingly, we do see in this period that there is evidence for the Isle of Axholme having an expansion of farming in this period. So it becomes more used as a farming area. And all of this food it would have been producing would have been then transported out to these larger settlements to help feed all the people, the soldiers that were now living there. It's quite likely that these farms were actually not being farmed by Romans, but were being farmed by the original Iron Age settlers. They, after all, have been living there for generations. They knew how the land worked. All the Romans really did is come along and say, right, you need to make sure you're paying your food to us, that you're paying your dues to us. Life probably was actually fairly consistent with how it had been continuing for the years previous. Now, this expansion of farming means that by the end of the Roman period, the primary forest on pretty much most of the land area had been cleared for agriculture. So this clearing of the land that started in the Mesolithic and the Neolithic is pretty much complete now. This means we've got plenty of open landscape of mixed arable, that's growing crops, and pastoral, that's raising cattle, raising pigs, farming, with lots of dikes and drains to help control those water levels. Indeed, we do actually see some flooding incidents in the late Roman periods, which may have been caused by all this agricultural intensification, this deforestation. And on the sandier areas, we do see some erosion starting to happen, which is probably because they were being overgrazed. So similar issues to overexploitation of the land that we do see in areas of the world today. Now, this is just a quick example. If you know the area, you might know Sandtoft. Now, this is an example of a Roman site that has been found. So in aerial photography, that's if you go onto Google Maps, you might be able to see some of it there. We can see the imprints in the existing fields of field systems and droveways that look very Roman in shape. Now, I've not been able to find evidence that an excavation has been completed here. But for the moment, we think that this is a Roman site. Now, actually, as part of our Presenting the Past programme, we have completed a community excavation near Belton. No, sorry, near Haxey, my apologies. And there we have actually found a Roman, very much Roman on the amount of pottery we found, agricultural area. So we know they were here. We know that they were living here, that they were growing crops here. And this is where we are going to have our first little pause. So if you remember earlier on, I asked you to get a pen and paper to hand. Well, you may have been using it for notes so far, but right now we're going to take a little bit of a break because I know I've been talking at you quite a lot, and we're just going to have a little bit of an activity. Now, when the Romans came to Britain, they did actually cause a change in diet and a change in what we were farming and what we were growing. Now, this is because up to the Iron Age, we're a fairly isolated island. Of course, the Roman Empire was huge. It was from Spain to the Middle East. It was down in Africa and all the way up to Britain. Now, the Roman soldiers that came across to Britain as part of the invasion, they didn't come from Rome. They came from all parts of the Roman Empire. And as such, they were used to all different sorts of diets and foods. So where this very mixed army went, they brought their food with them. And this, of course, introduced a lot of new different foodstuffs to the UK and meant that we were changing what we were growing, what we were eating. And we still have effects of this today in our current diet. So I thought it would be a rather fun activity to do, just to take a moment, have a look at a few different foodstuffs, and I want you to write a guess down for each one. I want you to guess whether we had that foodstuff in the Iron Age, if it was introduced by the Romans, or if it was introduced later on, just to really start thinking about all the different crops that we see. Okay. So these are our first 6 that we're going to be looking at. So over here, we've got corn, then tomatoes and lentils. We've got sheep, chickens, and those are carrots there. So I'm just going to give you a minute there just to have a few guesses of when you think that food was introduced to the UK. Was it in the Iron Age? Was it introduced in the Roman period? Or was it introduced later on? Okay, if you need any more time, do feel free to pause the presentation. Okay, and these are our next 6 we're looking at. So these leaves here are coriander. Of course, we've got potatoes here, grain, staple food stuff. We've got apples, rabbits, and these are walnuts over here. So coriander, potatoes, grain, apple, rabbits, walnuts. I'll give you a bit of time again just to put your guesses down. Do you think that we had those foods in the Iron Age? Were they introduced by the Romans, or were they introduced later on? Once again, if you want a bit more time, please do just pause. And these are our last 6 that we're going to be looking at. So a nice mixed bag again. We have, of course, got pigs here, turkey. Here are some limes, grapes, cow, and pears. So when were they used in the UK? Did we have them back in the Iron Age? Were they introduced by the Romans, or were they introduced later on? That's pigs, turkey, limes, grapes, cow, and pear. Okay, if you are not ready to see the answers yet, please do pause because they are coming up. There we go. So chicken, answer for chicken was Roman. They were actually introduced by the Romans. We did not have chickens in this country before the Romans arrived. Now think of how popular food stuff that is today. How many chickens are we actually raising on the Isle? So a huge change to what we're eating. Lentils introduced by the Romans. Carrots introduced by the Romans. Now, these ones here, sweet corn and tomatoes, they of course are both from the Americas. So were not introduced to this area until after America had been discovered, which was much, much later on. However, sheep, yes, we did have sheep in the Iron Age. Okay, next slide. So what did we have from the Romans? The Romans introduced walnuts, coriander, rabbits. That may surprise some of you. We actually did not have rabbits in this country until the Romans introduced them, or they became more prevalent from the medieval period onwards. And apples. So once again, some really common foodstuffs there. Apples we see all the time. And of course, rabbits we see on every roadside. Now, of course, potatoes, once again, potatoes are from the Americas, so no potatoes growing at this period in the Isle. But grain, lots and lots of grain, a really important Iron Age food stuff there. And our last slide, grapes. The Romans were massive wine lovers, so grapes was an important food for them to bring across. Now, of course, we're not known as great grape growers, mainly because of our climate over here, but they were at the very least bringing across wine and the exports of that there. And pears, much like apples again, introduced by the Romans. More recent, we have limes and turkeys. Once again, you can see a theme here. Turkeys are from the Americas. But pigs and cows, we had them in the Iron Age. We had them from earlier on. So what you're actually seeing here is, of course, quite a meaty diet in the selection of foodstuffs we had in this country, and a lot more restricted in variety. But of course, we would have been eating different things previous to the Romans. So we've still got the fish, we've got the oysters and all the marine life, as well as deer. They're still doing quite a varied diet, but not quite as varied as we know it today. And so that is some of the influence the Romans had on the landscape. It is an intensification of agriculture and a diversification of what we're growing as well. So we're going to skip on to the medieval period now. Now, the Isle, and actually most of the eastern half of this country, was settled by Scandinavian, or at least had a Scandinavian influence. Of course, that is Viking. You might know that more as. Now, the Isle, being part of this area, had significant Scandinavian Viking influence, and that's because it was an isle. Now, as I hinted at earlier, today we tend to think of rivers as being restrictive. We have to drive round them until we find a bridge to get over them. They restrict our movement. However, back then, they were the highways, they were the motorways, they were how people moved around and across the landscape. Putting your goods on a boat on a river, much quicker than making the trek over land. So the fact that the Isle of Axholme was an island didn't make it isolated so much as a real central trading point, a really easy point to get to. And so, of course, it was incredibly attractive to both the Saxons and the Scandinavians, these Vikings who were coming across. Now, like I said, in the later Roman period, there was some flooding going on because of the intensification, but this was recovered by the Saxon settlements. These areas were recovered a little bit, and settlement here was stabilized a bit once the Saxons arrived. And when they did arrive, they introduced a few new products. So hemp and flax were starting to be grown as part of textiles production. So farming no longer just food for sustenance, but also for clothing. Now, direct archaeological evidence for this period is lacking on the Isle. We do have a few Grubenhauser ground huts from the Saxon period, but elsewhere we do see that settlement is characterized by individual farmsteads. So this is a farmstead surrounded by their fields, quite isolated, no big towns or anything like that. The later and later we go, these homesteads start to move closer together and become more nucleated settlements. So what would we consider a hamlet or a village? Most villages in the area were then in existence by the late 11th century. And along with this came the development of the manorial system of landholding and estate management. So this is when landholdings start to be owned by single or very few number of powerful individuals, and then it's being worked on by people of a lower ranking. Now, we also do start to see Christianity and the parish system being introduced. Now, of course, this is hugely important for landholdings and who owns the land as well. So it is related to farming on the Isle. Now, the medieval period is quite distinct because of this system that they had for land ownership and land working. So you had a village, and the village would own or would work on blocks of land, but the inhabitants of the village would be responsible for a single agricultural unit known as a strip. And this would be quite a thin strip of land that they would work on in harmony with everybody else. So we call this strip farming, and we will go into it a little bit more, just because I want to make sure it is fully understood. It's quite a different way of farming and a different concept of land ownership to that which we have today. So first of all, you'd have your strip fields. This would not be a field where it would be fenced down either side. You would instead have a big open area, and everyone would know which strip they're farming. And everyone would be farming the same thing in that area so they could work together. So to the untrained eye, it would look like, for example, a big field of wheat or whatever crop they're growing. Whereas in actuality, it's lots of different strips owned by lots of different people. You would also have the commons, and this is land that everybody could use together. And this would supply grazing for people's animals. You could chop down wood, you could fish, you could gather wildfowl, and would be a common area. That's where the name comes from, common land. People will be able to obtain fish and eels from rivers, pools and dikes. And so in theory, people could obtain quite a lot of food from the area. But of course, we are talking about a manorial system of landholding. So a lot of the food people gathered would then have to be given to the main landowner, to the people above them in the social ranking, which means actually a lot of the people working on the land at the medieval period were severely malnourished. It was quite a difficult time to be alive. However, despite these difficulties, we do actually have some of the best records from this period. Now, this is mostly due to the Domesday Book, or the Domesday Book. Now, this is actually unique in Europe. Nowhere else do we see, pretty much in the world, such good recording of land ownership and land use at this time. We are really lucky as a country to have this. Now, if you want to do your own research on the Domesday Book, there is a fantastic resource online called Open Domesday. I do recommend you look it up. It's very easy to use, and you can actually do your own research to discover what your area, what your village was producing and was being used for at the time. If you would like to have a look at this and don't quite have the confidence yet, one of the other courses that we've produced for these digital series is about documentary research, and I do take you through that much more step by step if you want to have a little bit more support with that. Now, looking at the Domesday Book, from the Isle of Axholme, we see a really high concentration of fisheries. Now that, of course, is not surprising. There's so much water in the area. It is a key source of food. From archaeology and looking at botanical evidence, we see a similar pattern to what's been going on in the past. Woodland clearance, scrub clearance, agricultural intensification. People are trying to get more and more and more out of this landscape. And once again, these marshlands, these fens, they are highly sought after. We are seeing a much higher population in the marshland area, the fenland area, than we are in the dryland zones. So where you can access lots of different foodstuffs, that's where you want to be living. And as time goes on, more of this land ownership is being given over to the manors, to the churches, to the monastic houses. So we really are seeing social stratification, the people who own the land and the people who work on the land. Now, in the Isle of Axholme, we have some key landowners, especially in the north of the Isle of Axholme. So Selby Abbey and St Mary's Abbey in York own a lot of the land in the north of the Isle. And some monasteries, such as Axholme Priory and Oaston Ferry, we've got an Augustinian Priory, lots of different ones dotted around the landscape. They are directly working on the land themselves. And we see market centres happening at Crowle and Epworth as well. So this is where the food is being traded, bartered, sold on, and of course transported out of the Isle on these rivers. So this is a busy, busy landscape. Okay, so this is where we're going to just take a little bit more time to look at strip farming, because it is quite a phenomenon that we do need to understand. And once you know what you're looking for, you will actually start to see evidence of strip farming, even today in the landscape. Looking around is quite an easy factor to spot. So around most medieval villages, there were 3 large arable fields, and these were the ones that were being strip farmed. 2 were cropped, so 2 had things growing on them, and 1 was fallow. And that meant that they weren't growing anything that year. They were giving it a year to rest, to rejuvenate. Often they would be letting livestock graze on there. And of course, the livestock would be eating and pooing, which would help to manure the landscape. Now, in these 3 fields, they were strip divided. So there were strips in all fields, and people would know which ones were theirs. Now, these strips were long and narrow, and this was deliberately designed to reduce the number of turns an ox would have to do, or a horse would have to do, in ploughing the landscape. So they could go all the way up the field doing 1 strip, and that's 1 person's land. Now, most often people owned oxen to do this farming, and that is because oxen were much cheaper than horses, and also important, they were much tastier than horses as well. So once they got to the end of their life, another source of food for you. When they were ploughing, they would do this 3 times. So the first one would turn over the stubble, turn over the growth left over from the last time you were using the field. The second time would help to remove all the weeds, everything that's growing there, you don't want it. And the third would really get the ground ready for sowing. So in field number 1, you would have a wheat, a rye, grains of that kind. In field number 2, you'll have crops such as oats, barley, peas, lentils, broad beans. And in number 3, you would have fallow, so being left to rejuvenate. And these will be rotated every year. And what this means is the land is being managed to not run out of resources, not run out of nutrients, because you are changing what's growing on it every year. However, farmers, peasants would do what they could to increase fertility. A soil would only give out in crops what was put back in. So marl, now this is a mixture of clay and lime, and seaweed were used, but the best was dung, animal poo. That was the best way of fertilizing the landscape. But because we are talking lots of individual farmsteads, there were no large flocks like we have today, which means actually there was very little manure. So it sounds strange, but manure, that was a high quality item back then. That's what you want to increase your crops. Another factor of strip farming is that the timing of the harvest was really important. Of course, you wait too long and the grain gets too dry, the grain would fall off. Too wet and it would rot. So they were very heavily dependent on the weather. A bad year means a bad harvest, and that means famine. As an extra kind of difficulty for the peasants, though, the lord of the manor, who had his own fields as well, could demand boon work during the harvest time. And that was basically telling all the peasants, all the farmers on his land, that now is the time to harvest, so you're going to harvest my stuff first. Which of course means that the farmers were not harvesting their own crops at the appropriate times, and their crops, their yields were even lower. Like I said, famine was not uncommon during the medieval period. Crop yields in the Isle of Axholme, we think, are around 1/5 of what they are today. And half of that was then taken in taxes and rent by the lord of the manor. It equals to starvation. So not a good time to be alive, really, and quite restrictive. Now, before we move on, I just want everyone to have a look at this picture here. Now, this is not from the Isle of Axholme, I would like to point out, but it is a really good picture and a really good example. Because medieval farming had to do this 3-plough method to really get through the land, they actually left quite big scars in the landscape of the ridges, which are the top bits here, and the furrows. There we are, and that's where they were planting. And this created such a scar in the landscape that we do still see it in fields today. So if you are walking around and you see a field which has this characteristic hump and bump, it might well not be as distinctive as that. It might be a lot more gradual and rolling. That is actually evidence of medieval strip farming. So I think you'll remember that I said one of our aims for this course is you'll be able to identify that by the end. I urge you, go out, have a walk, have a look around, and I'm sure you'll spot it. And once you get your eye in, you will start seeing it everywhere. There we go. So that was medieval strip farming. We are now going to skip forward in time again and get to the draining of the Isle. Now, I have to confess, this actually isn't a subject I knew much about before I started the Presenting the Past project with the Isle of Axholme and Hatfield Chase Landscape Partnership. This is because this is a very, very localized piece of history, but it is an incredibly important piece of history, and I'm really pleased I've learned about it because it is so important and it's created so much change in the Isle of Axholme. So after the dissolution of the monasteries, that of course was Henry VIII, the lands were given that were previously owned by the churches and the monasteries, they were given to the gentry. So Axholme and Hurst priories and Temple Bellwood, all those monasteries, they became country houses, county houses. And so we have the land being owned by people of higher birth now. Now the Isle of Axholme, because of all the water around it, functioned quite differently to much of the other areas in the country. Most of the common land, the land that everybody could use and access, was flooded from around Martinmas, which is the 11th of November, till May Day. That's half the year underwater. Now, whilst many people from the outside might think that's a waste of land, that's land that you cannot use for half the year, this flooding actually brought in more soil and really, really high fertile soil. It meant the crops could actually grow better, which of course, when you're low on manure and other fertilizers, is incredibly important. We have records that say Epworth and Westwood were able to keep 12,000 cattle over winter, and Crowell had 400 acres of dry winter pasture. So they had enough to keep good herds on. However, we do also have records that the islanders were having disputes with their Nottinghamshire neighbours for using up this land, so it did create some pressures. But overall, this was a really valuable farming landscape. It just functioned slightly differently due to the floods. Produce included meat, dairy, leather, barley, wheat, peas, hemp, flax, and this helped to supply the sack and the canvas industry, which were just getting established. The high ground was unusually fertile as well, with no fallow years, so that's people not even bothering to have the fields out for fallow for their rest periods, recorded in Crowell and Eastoft. So people are using the land even more than they're able to elsewhere. So although yields not quite as good as we see today, for the time, they were really good. In Crowell, actually, the capacity of the commons was so great that they rented out their land to neighbours as well, so another source of income. So when it was proposed that this land was going to be drained, those annual floods were going to be taken away, it perhaps shouldn't be surprising that this was massively opposed by the locals. So the draining of the Isle was perhaps instigated by King James and King Charles, and they were really eager to engage and encourage land improvement. So on the face of it, they're trying to, improve the landscape, improve yields, which doesn't sound bad. And to approach this, they went to landowners and experts to report on whether they thought land could be improved. And this is where Cornelius Vermuyden comes in. He reported back to the king that he could drain the Isle, and King Charles gave him the work. And it was arranged that the land, once it had been drained, would be divided into thirds. As payment for his work, Cornelius would be given a third of the land. 1/3, of course, would remain with the king, and then 1/3 would remain for the people who actually lived there, the commoners. Once again, not the best step perhaps in developing local relations. So the work by Vermuyden and his workers, who were called participants, in the 1620s involved creating lots of artificial rivers and dikes and stopping the rivers of the Idle, the Thorn and the Don. Now, the drainage and acquiring these large areas of common land by the Crown and by Cornelius Vermuyden and his men, and taking it away from the commoners, did bring massive social unrest and far-reaching changes in the local farming economy and land ownership. After all, how would you feel if a Dutchman, Cornelius Vermuyden, and the king came in and decided to completely change your lifestyle, completely change your livelihood, and take away some of the land that you depended on? So once the commons were drained, they were still a productive area. They continued to provide wood and reeds. They continued to provide sand and clay to manure arable lands, to provide fish, fowl, rabbits for consumption and trade. Hay was being cut in some areas. And grazing, of course, was being used for livestock, which meant that stock could be kept all year round. But as a result of Vermuyden's drainage, the Isle commons were reduced. So the land that people could use freely was reduced between around 1/2 and 1/3 of their former size. So while still productive, they were smaller. Moreover, these familiar patterns, these patterns people were used to living with of flooding and dry land, were disrupted. So this meant that drinking water for farm stock was no longer freely available. And the loss of this regular flooding, which improved the landscape, improved the fertility, was gone. The fact that a lot of water disappeared also meant that a lot of fishing and fowling, so that's of course the shooting of ducks, had disappeared. And this was actually a massive grievance to people in the time. In the 1630s, the Axholme residents were compensated for their loss of fishing by an award. So this is like an amount of money, a grant, to assist the poor. So this was helping them to set up new businesses in making sackcloth. While Crow, a bit further north, their inhabitants were eventually compensated by being given land north of the town. And even today, these lands are still known as the fishing grounds, because they were the lands given to Crow to compensate for the loss of their fishing grounds. So that's where the name comes from. So that is a brief look at the draining of the Isle and the effect that this had on the landscape. Now we are around halfway through, so we are going to have a little bit of a break time now. As I said before, even if you don't feel like you need a break, I do suggest that you pause this now, that you stand up, that you go get a drink, that you walk around outside for a moment, just to give yourself a break from the screen and from my voice. And you'll be able to come back a bit more refreshed. Okay, welcome back. I hope you all had a good break and you've managed to refresh yourselves slightly before we delve into the second half of farming on the Isle of Axholme. So for the next half, we're going to be looking at two main case studies. We are going to be looking at the flax industry, which was very important on the Isle after the drainage. And we're going to be looking at open fields. And for that, we're going to be looking back on the strip farming system and a very, very unique preservation of this actually on the Isle of Axholme itself. So we're going to get started with the flax industry. Now, after the drainage, the Isle of Axholme was still quite different to the surrounding area. Fishing, fowling, hemp and flax were all major industries, and hemp and flax was mainly being produced for sackcloth. Now, people who were growing flax and hemp could then take this back and spin it themselves, which created a large-scale domestic industry, so almost a cottage industry on the Isle, of this spinning and weaving of the flax and hemp. For your average peasant family of the 16th century, it was a really profitable kind of side business. And to the poor, it was actually a principal income. So the growing of flax on the Isle was very, very important. Now, if you remember, I said after the drainage of the Isle in around the 1630s, there was an award, a grant almost, to compensate the people of the area for losing so much of their common land. And this was, a lot of it was used to help employ the poor in making sackcloth, to give them this alternative income. Moving forwards from this investment, by the mid-19th century, this domestic cottage industry gave way to steam-powered flax mills, although this was relatively short-lived because by 1900 the industry had died out. Now, we have a few different reports from this flax making time on the Isle. So, for example, in 1744, there was a massive fire in Haxey. It burnt down 62 houses, and the fire commenced in a flax manufactory near the church, and is supposed, according to folklore, to have been the act of arson. So a few days before, coincidentally, the master of the manufactory discharged one of his men for misconduct. Now, this man was committed to Lincoln Castle on suspicion, but with no further evidence, he was acquitted. But flax was a huge industry in the area. So let's delve slightly more into flax to really get an understanding of this fibre, of this plant that was being grown on the Isle. Now, flax makes linen. Now, linen is one of the strongest vegetable cloths, and it has actually around 2 to 3 times the strength of cotton. Now, linen yarn is created and spun from really long fibres that are found behind the bark of the flax plant. Now, linen fibres are known for their luster, that's their shine and their strength. So they're quite a desirable they create quite a desirable fabric. Now, in order to retrieve these flax fibres from the plant, the woody stem and the inner pith, which holds the fibres together, is rotted away. And then the fibre that's left is spinnable and used for the production of linen thread, for cordage, for twine, for making all these different items. So let's start right at the beginning, growing flax. So flax seeds are sown often in April or May, mainly when all the risk of frost has passed. Within 3 to 4 months, the plant will grow, will finish growing with these straight, slender stalks that may be around 2 to 4 feet high, with small blue or white flowers, which we can see a lovely flax flower here. When the flax plant turns yellow and the seeds turn brown, that's time to harvest. Harvest has to happen really quite quickly because the longer you wait, the duller the fibres will get. And of course, you want nice shiny linen fibres. Now, these stalks, once picked, are tied into bundles called beats, and then they are ready for the extraction of flax. The next stage of the process is rippling. So rippling is the first stage after harvest, where the seeds and leaves are removed from the stems. In this, the top ends of the bundle of stems are pulled through a ripple. Now, this is a comb-like tool consisting of around 20 to 30 vertical steel pins. It's not the best picture, but you can just see those steel pins here. Once that has happened, we move on to retting. There we go. Now, in retting, this is when the bundles are soaked or waterlogged in water so that the woody bark in the pith can rot away. Now, this can happen a few different ways. The way in the picture you can see is pool retting. So this is using a stagnant pool of water, and it requires around 13 days. This produces quite a brittle fibre. For better or for more high quality fibres, you can also rot the bundles or rot them in streams, or you can also rot them in vats of water. It's mainly submerging the fibres in water to encourage that retting process. Now, on the Isle, we do actually have some evidence for retting pits. So that is holes now filled in, but we see them archaeologically, which would have been filled with water for the retting of these fibres. Once we have retted, we can then scooch. So scooching is breaking. When the decomposed woody tissue is dry, so once it's been retted, we then let it dry and then crushed. So sometimes in the more mechanical industries, they are sent through these rollers, which helps to break up the stem and separate all the fibres that we need. In more perhaps traditional methods, this can also be done by hand. And the main idea of it is to, now that the bark and the pith is all rotted, this is now to release them from the flax fibres that we're after. And then we have hackling. So this is basically combing. This is when we comb through the fibres through some more steel pins. So this helps to remove the last bits of that fibrous core of the bark, and also to align the bundles align the fibres ready for spinning. So this is put through a series of combs ranging from a coarse comb to a fine comb, and the fibres are pulled through the teeth, beginning with the coarser, leaving the fine fibres at the end. And this separates all the fibres into the correct bundles. Now, the very, very finest fibres are the long, lustrous ones, and these may be up to 12 to 20 inches in length, so they're quite a length as well. And finally, we get to spinning. So this is when we start to spin all of the fibres to create a thread. Now, as you'll see from this picture here, this is actually a picture of flax, believe it or not. It looks just like hair, really. And that's where the term flaxen hair comes from, because it, once spun, it has this lovely, lovely, shiny blonde look that does look very much like hair. So you can see why people went through this long process to create it. It is a desirable fabric. It creates a desirable product. But why go through all of this trouble? That's quite a process to be creating cloth. So on the plus side, it's a really strong material. It's even stronger when it's wet, unbelievably. It also drapes well. That means that when it's being worn on the body, it hangs really nicely. It's fairly heat resistant. It's cool to wear in the summer. It absorbs moisture and yet also dries quickly. It's easy to clean, and of course it's got that slight shine to it as well. It is really quite a lovely fabric to use, and in some areas it's now seeing a resurgence. There's this very, very natural fibre to use in clothing. Of course, no fabric is ever perfect, so it's not got no elasticity, it's got no give to it. It wrinkles very easily, it's got no resilience to that. It will be slowly broken down by sunlight. So if you had, for example, linen curtains on a very bright window, the light would start to break it down, but it does still last longer than cotton in that regard. It is vulnerable to mildew, being an organic fibre, being a natural fibre. Of course, it can be affected by mildew, and it can also get sweat stains. So possibly not the best to wear if you're a sweatier person. Now, before we finish looking at that, I do want to mention the Flax Project. Now, of course, this course, Farming on the Isle, is being run by Presenting the Past, which is our project. And this is one of 16 projects, if you remember, being organised by the Isle of Axholme and Hatfield Chase Landscape Partnership, funded by the National Lottery Heritage Fund. Now, one of those other 16 projects is the Flax Project. Now, this project is looking at the heritage of flax on the Isle more specifically than ours, because of course we're just looking at what people are interested in from the heritage. The Flax project is really focusing in on what the flax did on the Isle. So they have been identifying old rutting pits, they have been growing some of their own flax, and they have in fact managed to, I think, take some of it and spin it as well. So really working through that process to restore that industry, that heritage to the Isle. Those fields of waving blue flowers, once lost, they have been exploring again. So that was our case study looking at flax. So this is going to be our second case study and our last real topic before we end. We've got a couple more things to look at, but this is our last big topic. And we're going to be looking at the importance of belts and fields. So this is looking back at strip farming. Do you remember that medieval practice that we were talking about? Now, before we start, I do want to say that most, if not all, of the information from this has come from a fantastic report called Strip Farming Remembered by Terry Fulton. And much of the information, most of the infographics have been taken from that. So all credit to him. And I want to thank him for doing that research because it is such an important area to look at. If you want to have a look at it yourself, if you Google it, you'll be able to find links to where you can download or access that report. So Strip Farming Remembered by Terry Fulton. There we go. So we are just quickly going to return to this graph that I showed earlier. So of course we saw how farming in all areas, not just the Isle of Axholme, has started this population growth, this population increase. We go past that massive dip of the Black Death, and then we hit this bit here. And this is the bit we're going to be looking at now. We've moved through time and we are looking at this bit here. So in the early Victorian period, there were rapid developments in agriculture, transport, industry. And part of this was abolishing the old ways of working. So centuries of old strip farming that's been going on since the medieval period, since around here we've been having strip farming, this is all being abolished. And we are now creating the field systems that we see today. So roads are being built, land is being reallocated to people. And this is all done through a process called the enclosure process. So between 1604 and 1914, little more than 1/5 of the England was enclosed. And this means that they are created into new fields with fences. The land is enclosed. So strip farming, going on since the medieval period, this suited society at the time. It wasn't very advanced, but each village, because they worked together, were self-sufficient. And so there wasn't much investment in the transport between different towns or villages. However, with population growing with industry, there are more people. So there is suddenly the need to be transporting food to these big industrial centres, so these big towns, these big cities. And so new roadways, new waterways, and new agricultural advances are needed to benefit industrialised England. The needs have changed. And in order to facilitate this change, the government needs to take control. And so they decide that they are going to redistribute the land. They're going to change how people use it. And to identify what land is going to be used for what crop or which animal is going to be grazing there, they actually look at the land and say, right, this area of the country is really well suited to grazing, whereas this area is really well suited to crops. Now, just to take a personal example, I am not actually from Lincolnshire. I grew up in Devon, so another very, very rural landscape. And when I was growing up, it's incredibly normal for me to go past fields and fields and fields of cows, of sheep, mainly cows, because it's a really good landscape down there for them. It's quite hilly and they can handle that incline really well, and it's just a good landscape for them to live in. And so there's a lot of cows being reared there. When I moved to Lincolnshire, still a rural landscape, it looked completely different to me because there is so much more emphasis on growing crops here, especially out in the fens. You've got the root crops that do really well in that soil. And so this, in a bit, is actually coming back from this Enclosure Act with the government saying, down there, really good for grazing. Up here, the soil is really fertile, really good for growing crops. And so rather than seeing villages surrounded by a little bit of everything, you are having areas being identified as being particularly efficient for producing one thing, and then focusing on that thing. And so enclosure becomes necessary. Now, there are 3 stages of the enclosure process. So first of all, owners of at least 3/4 of the village land had to agree to the enclosures. And so this was done through petitions and notices. Stage 2, the parliamentary committee hearing sat and made a decision with commissioners to oversee the redistribution of the land. And in the last stage would be a map would be drawn up with the current landowners, then a map drawn up with the new landowners, and these new landowners can build the fences surrounding their land. Fences are almost something new here, the identification that this is land that belongs to me and only me. Now, this once again is a controversial issue, and it has people arguing for both sides. So in favour, the enclosure was necessary for the growth and development of the economy. Against, as you can probably guess, it deprived the poor. It took land away from the poor and redistributed it in the hands of the wealthy few. The Enclosure Acts basically took away the rights people had to rural land by taking away their commons. In compensation, these poorer people were either offered land of poor quality, or they were pushed towards the cities to go and work in industry to get their paycheck. Of these seized lands, these privately owned farms, the political farmers got the finest land, so those connected to politics. To give an example of this, even today, in a property owning democracy, we are all taught to save up money so we can buy our own house. It's a property owning democracy. Still, half of the land in this country is owned by 0.06 of the population. And this is coming back to these wealthier farmers who already owned a lot of the land, going to enclosure to then be able to enclose their land and push away the poorer people. I mean, the positives of this is that less land was wasted. It was being well farmed and not poorly farmed, and there were better crops and animals suited to the environment, but it did come at a cost to the poorer person. And actually, if you are more interested in English and literary themes, then if you look at the Romantic poets who were writing at this time, you can actually see, arguing against the Enclosure Act, a lot of Romantic poets almost did a protest poetry against it. We have an example here by Oliver Goldsmith, and the line that I've highlighted, whilst all of the verse is good, really does highlight what they were arguing against. The man of wealth and pride takes up the space that many poor supplied. It was a massive change in the landscape, and it changed how society operated. Enclosure Acts, whilst they did do some good, destroyed the place and communities that defined a place, that people have been living there for generations, for even hundreds of years. They were being moved on. And it's this sense of loss and indeed trauma that can be seen in a lot of these protests. However, there were some areas in England where complete enclosure of the open fields never took place. And as such, there are, I think we found 6 places remaining in England which have remnants of strip farming. And the Isle of Axholme is the most extensive of them. So once again, the Isle of Axholme being quite a significant place in our farming history. And this is because whilst the commons were enclosed, the strip fields in some areas were not touched. And so these weren't included in the enclosure process. Now, the best place to see this on the Isle is in the village of Belton, because you can see 3 field types in this area. The remnants of these open strip fields, early enclosed fields, and the more formal modern enclosed fields. Now, the area of strip farming in Belton Fields that continues to this day is known as Belton Open Fields. And it's partly survived because it is enclosed by minor roads. So we can see a bit of it here. We've got a road coming along here and under there. And underneath it, you can see all these different strips coming down here, which is quite different to these larger, more rectangular fields we have over here. And this more open look more accurately reflects what medieval farming would have looked like. So we're going to return ever so quickly to this slide just to remind ourselves. So of course, strip farming was introduced in the medieval period. It was a system that gave individuals land to feed themselves in their individual strips. But because the strips were farmed then together in a whole massive field, it meant people could work together and share the cost of an oxen, of a plough, to feed themselves. And as such, it did require teamwork. It required people to work together. But there wasn't much freedom in it at all. You were given your land, you had to give your taxes and part of your harvest to the lord of the manor. You still had to work on the lord of the manor's land, but also you were not able to try anything new. For example, if your strips are in a field that is going to be growing grain that year and you want to grow broad beans, you still have to grow grain because it's being ploughed at the right time of the year to grow grain. Your plants are going to get destroyed if you're growing different things. And so there's not much room for experimentation, not much room for freedom. And that's one of the benefits of enclosure. It gave farmers the ability to work all their land together and be able to try and see if things worked better in different landscapes. Now, in Belton Fields, we see these traditional strips. Now, these were traditionally 220 by 22 yards, so really long and thin. Now, these strips were grouped into sets called furlongs, and these furlongs were often given identifying names, some of which are still in use today, and we'll have a look at some of them in a moment. There were no permanent boundaries, so no hedges, no fence between these strips or furlongs, which is why Belton Fields is given the name open fields, and why when these, in other areas of the country, when they were given to landowners, these landowners put on fences, why that was called the Enclosure Act, because they were enclosing their area. So because there were no permanent boundaries between strips or furlongs, each farmer's allocation of land consisted of a number of strips, which in some cases were widely scattered throughout the fields. And because they're scattered, there was no concept of having a farmhouse surrounded by their land. And this is when we really start to see nucleated settlements, because instead of being able to have a farmhouse on their land, people would live together and then move out into the fields to farm together. So this is when we really start to see villages. Now, a big question with strip farming is how these strip farming systems are originated. And this is a matter of continuing debate. So were these fields laid out in a single operation? Did one day they say, this is how we're going to farm, let's go and farm like this? Or was it a gradual process taking many, many, many years? As always with these things, it probably was somewhere in between. However it happened, we do get to a point where places like Belton Open Fields are being strip farmed. And so we come up to enclosure. Now, the gradual process of enclosure began hundreds of years ago, and it differed wildly from place to place. It happened in response to pressure for food and of demands on the agricultural profession. Now, in the Middle Ages, outbreaks of plague, especially the Black Death, remember that graph we saw earlier, were important in this process. Lords were forced to sell off their land as population decline made farming this way difficult. Later, in Tudor times, some areas like the Midlands and East Yorkshire saw whole villages depopulated and their enclosure fenced to allow powerful landlords to develop sheep farming at a time when the woolen industry was booming. So even before the formal government-mandated enclosure, we get this piecemeal enclosure happening slowly throughout hundreds of years. Now, on a smaller scale, there were always the owner-occupiers of strips of land looking for ways to improve their status and profits. So this led to the piecemeal buying and exchanging of strips to allow people to consolidate their holdings. And then we move on to the formal enclosure, and this is when this process really starts to accelerate. So this happened from the mid-18th to the early 19th century, and this was intensive enclosure of all the remaining open fields and commons. And this is what we call the enclosure movement. Now, this can be subdivided into two parts. In the mid-1700s, so very, very early, this was happening due to a shortage of pasture and growing populations. So people needed food. And later on, in the late 1700s, early 1800s, this was due to effects of war with France. Now, the scale of this operation, the fact that it was all happening at the same time, meant that as people were drawing up their maps, they inevitably drew their fields into a convenient, regular size and shape. So the landscape that was caused by this parliamentary enclosure consisted of very much a similar landscape that we see today. And through this, with farmers suddenly owning a large area of very conveniently sized land all in one area, this led to farmers then building houses in the middle of their farmlands, and we get the creation of the farm homestead surrounded by their fields because it was a more convenient location. However, there were exceptions, and this is where we're really getting onto Belton open fields. The best known exception is actually Laxton in Northamptonshire, which has been deliberately preserved. It retains not just the strip farming, but also the organisation of the open field village. However, the strips on the Isle of Axholme are the most extensive of the ones that have been left. And this has happened because the enclosure award, the directives being issued by government, was a lot more limited in scope in Belton because it was only restricted to the commons. So the existing strip fields, the open fields, were left and they continue to be used. Now, as we can see, we've got a nice map here, once again, from Terry Fulton's excellent report, showing the organisation and layout of Belton fields. Now, even if you walk here today, and I do recommend it, there are some fantastic little footpaths across this land, it's still a very, very open landscape. So it's a great way of understanding the vista, the look of the open field landscape of the Middle Ages. So what we're going to do now is just walk through a history of Belton fields to really understand how this landscape has been preserved and changed. So our overall view of developments in the landscape is reliant upon the record evaluations from 1910. This is where we are getting a lot of our information from for this. Now, this was a national parish by parish survey to establish a value for every piece of land, so that people understood what the land was doing. And this showed that there had been a reduction in the number of strips in Belton Field by around a quarter. And so in around 1910, we know there were 280 strips left. Now, this is in part due to different influences that are acting on the landscape. In some cases, the strips were decreasing as people sold and merged different strips together to create larger holdings. And in some cases, people were selling them. They were coming on hard times and they needed to divide their strips. So Belton Fields was achieving a balance of sorts that enabled it to survive. Now, a good example of this, of the merging of strips, is in 1848, when we have records of a Thomas Robson of Carhouse, when he bought 2 sirloins in Upper Goosepits furlongs. Remember those those names I was talking about earlier. So in the Upper Goosepits furlong, he bought 2 sirloins. Now, before this, we have evidence that Robson owned very little, but he did already have 1 strip in Upper Goosepits and shared 2 others with a Samuel Martin. And Samuel also owned another 2 strips in Upper Goosepits. So here, Mr. Robson is not only improving his situation by owning more land, he's actually consolidating his land as well, and a more convenient block of land to farm with his business partner. Now, this would have put most of Upper Goosepits in their hands. So we have a merging of the strips. However, we also sometimes get them separating. So on the other hand, there are several examples of this separation of previously amalgamated holdings arising. So one such case comes from the tradition of partitioning off your inheritance. So when John Colkwell, who was formerly a miller at the post mill, died, he left 1 strip in the Medley furlong to his son John, 2 sirloins to his son Abraham, and the rest, which totaled 3 acres, to his other son Joseph. All of this land had previously been controlled by 1 unit, by John Colkwell, who had built it up through a series of purchases, but he now separated it to his 3 sons, and so more strips are then created, or at least the strips are then reverted to. Now, because of this, the ownership of strips became quite a marketable area. When landowners of larger blocks of land saw cause for selling, the opportunity was given for other landowners to consolidate their own holdings. And for ambitious and thrifty peasants to acquire a few strips and create a new holding themselves. A good example is of George Haller in 1845. We have records that he bought 1 strip in Lower Goosepits, and he is never previously mentioned in the tithe award. That's the details of who owns what land. So before this, he had no land of his own. So when he bought these strips, he entered the ranks for the first time of the landowning smallholders. And also, of course, by owning just a couple of strips, maintain this tradition of strip farming. Now, of course, in the 1880s, there were plenty of opportunities for labourers like George Haller. At this time, we have an agricultural depression, which was quite damaging to grain and meat producers, who would have been among the Isle of Axholme farmers and labourers. Many of them had brought the land at really high prices in the prosperous mid-century, only to find later on in the Depression years they were unable to keep up interest prices on their mortgage. while land prices were still falling. And so we see this spike in land sales as people try to sell off their land. And this in part, once again, helps to preserve Belton open fields because people are able to buy 1 or 2 strips according to their income. Now, to escape this depression of farming, which was caused by a dramatic fall in grain prices when the American prairies were opened up to cultivation and transport of grain was coming across from the Americas, farming had to find a new direction to find profit. And one escape from this was market gardening. Now, the excellent soils of the Isle of Axholme and the tradition of this strip farming, small-scale farming, made it ideal for this type of gardening. Within the Depression, there was a renewed interest in vegetable growing. And because of the fertile soils on the Isle, this brought those islanders who owned those strips particular success, particularly actually in growing potatoes and celery. Interestingly, 2 crops that are not native to this country that have been brought across at later periods. And then as this vegetable farming takes off, we see those land sales fall that we saw in that graph earlier. Now, because of this, that we actually see the owners in Belton increase. So more people have bought those single strips or a couple of strips to do this market gardening. And in turn, this agricultural depression is actually helping to preserve Belton open fields. However, after this, Belton Field underwent its most dramatic reduction in strip numbers. It went from around 280 holdings to 80. That's a loss of around 2/3. Furthermore, because so many amalgamations have happened, some of these, like these areas up here and down here, couldn't really be described as strips anymore. The problem was, by the mid-1900s, smallholders were being squeezed by large agricultural corporations who were able to compete in quantity and price for their products. So this is the movement of big business in a way, and it was squeezing out these smaller holdings. And the next 40 years continued to see an amalgamation of strips due to a number of reasons. And this is getting on to more modern day reasons that we would recognise today. So some of this is due to social change. Today, children of farming families no longer automatically follow their parents onto careers on the land. And so when these parents get to retirement age, they either sell or lease their land. And this is something that's been unheard of in previous generations. This either lets their neighbours buy land or consolidate their own share, or quite often in Belton Fields, newcomers buy their land for pony paddocks. There has also been a change in farm structure policy, and I won't get too much into this, but this is almost similar to the Enclosure Act in spirit. So the UK and EU governments in the 1970s were trying to encourage the creation of farming units that were more economic by amalgamating small farms. And we do know that some farmers in Belton Fields took this encouragement and helped their fields be amalgamated to encourage more economic farming. There was also the EU system, which was subsidising farmers who were growing cereals and oilseeds. Now, whilst this was to encourage production of these crops, which was needed, both of these crops favour large-scale production methods. So this strip farming on Belton Fields was being missed out because we were mainly growing vegetables, and so they weren't subsidised. And so once again, this was encouraging people to consolidate their strips to create these larger areas to gain these subsidies. So is there hope for Belton Fields? We're seeing this massive decline. However, even as modern life seems to be crowding out the remnants of strip farming here, the reverse process is also happening, because there is an increasing awareness that this is an important heritage, and this awareness is providing the motivation to recreate and protect these landscapes. So some strips have now been bought with the express desire of protecting them and keeping them being farmed as strips. And I mean, your attendance on this course is further evidence that people are interested in this farming heritage. And so we're going to have a quick brief pause here now. Now, of course, unfortunately, this is a digital course. I can't hear your responses, but I do want you to have a good think about this. What do you think should happen in Belton Fields? Should we protect it and preserve it for our heritage, maintain it as a strip farming industry? Or should we leave it alone? One thing that the work done by Terry Fulton, showing how strips have been brought together and broken apart and how they've been gradually declining, it's telling the story of a continuously evolving and adapting landscape that has been put under different political and social pressures. Should we let it alone so it can continue adapting and continue telling a story of how our society is changing? Now, on the original course, when this was run the first time, we were then able to take the group out and actually walk about Belton Fields and have a look at it for ourselves. Like I said, it is a unique area of the landscape. Now, obviously, we're doing this online and we can't do this today. However, I do recommend that if you ever have the opportunity to go and have a walk in Belton, I do recommend you go and do it. It is fascinating to be able to see heritage that has been preserved in such a way. Now, of course, if you don't live in Belton, please do still get your walking boots on and go for a look around. See if you can identify those medieval strip farming remnants in fields today. However, I would like to just follow this up with, of course, that any walking you do is on your own risk, and we cannot take any responsibility for you going out and about in the fields. Please do stick to footpaths and follow the country code as you do so. And so we are coming to the end of this course. Thank you so much for sticking with me so far. We are just going to finish with a look at farming and archaeology, how farming today affects archaeology. There we go. So agriculture is a primary use of land on the Isle of Axholme today. Wheat was a main crop in 1801 because the soils on the Isle of Axholme are particularly suited, and of course a lot of the enclosure means that wheat can be grown really nicely in these big fields. Wheat also cannot really be grown in other areas in Lincolnshire, such as on the heath and the wolds, and so is particularly favoured. Now, wheat does require the land to be ploughed, and this is significant for archaeology because ploughing, driving those big metal spikes underneath ground, it digs up and it disrupts the archaeology below. So ploughing brings things up, and then manuring, especially manuring from older times, and not so much from today, introduces new artifacts to the area. So first of all, we've got ridge and furrow. Now this is the name for the remnants of strip farming. Now you can see we've got some lines coming down here. These are the furrow lines that someone has dug in the past. Now we actually found these on another project we've been doing on Presenting the Past, which is digging test pits in Belton. Now these marks show historic farming that's happened in the area. So this is some of the marks that farming leaves behind. Farming, however, as well as digging up archaeology, also reveals it. So when you plant a large area with the same crop, how well that crop grows in different areas is indicative of the soil quality. Now, If the soil is particularly rocky, for example, if there is a buried wall underneath it, there is going to be less water there. And so the crops mature quicker and create marks. Alternatively, if there was a historic ditch in that area, even though it's been filled in, it will still hold water better than the surrounding area, which means crops will be able to grow deeper roots and grow slower. And so, as we can see by this lovely line here, they are maturing later and going into flower later. And so farmers with their big fields actually help to reveal, there we go, some amazing areas of archaeology that we would not be able to identify without them. Farmers also are the experts of their land. They work on it every single day. And many farmers have a really deep understanding of the topography, of the soil and the geology of the land. They are the ones who, when walking their fields, find artifacts that have been dug up by ploughing. They know the areas that have been producing lots of artifacts and the areas that haven't been producing many at all. We are hoping that by partnering with farmers to gain their information, to record their histories and their stories, we'll be able to gain a much more nuanced understanding of what is happening on their land, archaeologically speaking. And so that's how we are going to work with modern day farming to further understand the Isle. And that brings us to the end of the course. So just to recap, we have looked at today how farming was introduced to the area and how farming has changed throughout all the different years. We have looked at some specific case studies on the Isle, including flax farming and how belt and open fields, a strip farming from the medieval period, has survived to today. And lastly, we just quickly reviewed how farming today will help us reveal the archaeology of the past. Now, this course was originally delivered in person, and so I would have been able to take your questions to go at a speed that was more suited to you and to really identify which areas you were interested in. However, I hope we have managed to answer some questions today. Now, this work has been carried out as part of the Isle of Axholme and Hatfield Chase Landscape Partnership, funded by the National Lottery Heritage Fund. So we have to give thanks to both of those for hosting and for funding this work. This project, Presenting the Past, has been run by Heritage Lincolnshire. If you'd like to learn any more about the work we do, please do Google Heritage Lincolnshire and you can find out all about us. We have produced 3 other courses for this work, and you'll be able to find these online as well. So they are looking at archaeology on the Isle, looking at a case study in Ancots at the church, and looking at how you can complete your own documentary research. I do hope you've enjoyed this course, and if you have any feedback, please do not hesitate to contact us. Many thanks.